The billionaire CEO's furious voice cracked like a whip across the marble lobby, sharp enough to make receptionists flinch and interns silently pray they weren't next. But the real shock, the moment that would be whispered about for months, came when the janitor he was berating lifted his arm to wring out a mop, and the old sleeve of his uniform slid back just enough to expose a faint weathered tattoo, a symbol so rare, so deeply tied to a past wrapped in secrecy, that Maxwell Hartley, a man known for his iron composure and cold dominance, suddenly froze mid-insult, his face draining of color as though he had seen a ghost rising in front of him. And in that instant, while the entire building held its breath, Eric, the janitor, the single father, the quiet man who had mastered the art of being invisible, felt only confusion, because he had spent years hiding that mark, burying everything it represented under layers of exhaustion and ordinary responsibility, never imagining that a simple twist of his wrist would unravel the life he had fought so hard to protect. Moments earlier, Maxwell had been in full tyrant mode, unleashing every drop of stress and arrogance on the easiest target available, shouting about how the floors were never clean enough, how the building deserved better, how people like Eric needed to do their damn jobs, and Eric, though humiliated, had kept his eyes down because he had learned long ago that pride didn't feed his son, patience did. But everything changed the moment Maxwell's eyes landed on that symbol, the hawk curled protectively around a star, and in an office tower filled with analysts, executives, and dreamers hustling for their future, the wealthiest man in the building suddenly looked like a terrified child reliving a nightmare he thought he'd outrun. Eric instinctively tugged his sleeve back down, heat blooming under his skin as embarrassment and fear tangled inside him, but Maxwell stepped toward him with a trembling urgency no one had ever witnessed from the famously ruthless CEO, his voice cracking as he whispered, "Where did you get that?" A question so fragile, so unlike the man the world knew, that several employees exchanged bewildered glances, unsure whether they were witnessing a breakdown or a revelation. Eric stammered out a quiet, nervous response that it was a nothing, just something old, but Maxwell shook his head violently, his eyes burning with disbelief, like he was staring at a piece of a past he'd buried beneath years of power, wealth, and denial. And then something inside him snapped, because he suddenly barked, "Come with me, now," though the tremor in his voice betrayed how deeply shaken he was. Eric hesitated, gripping the mop handle like a lifeline, not understanding why a billionaire was reacting to an old tattoo as though it were a ticking bomb, but before he could speak, Maxwell was already marching toward the executive elevator, not caring that the entire lobby was watching with wide, stunned eyes. Security guards exchanged uncertain looks, unsure whether to follow or stay back, while the receptionist slowly lowered her phone mid-dial, too shocked to remember what she'd been doing. Eric followed cautiously, not because he wanted to, but because something in Maxwell's voice, something between fear and desperation, felt impossible to ignore. When the elevator doors closed around them with a soft metallic sigh, Eric found himself face to face with a man who no longer looked like a CEO, but like someone fighting old ghosts clawing their way back to life. The silence was heavy, suffocating, and Eric could feel his pulse pounding in his throat as he finally asked, "What's going on? Why does this tattoo matter so much to you?" Maxwell didn't answer right away. Instead he stared at the rising floor numbers as though each one peeled back another layer of memory, his jaw trembling slightly despite his attempt to mask it. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, raw, stripped of all arrogance. "Because that symbol belonged to someone who saved my life." The words hit the air like a slow-falling bomb. Eric's breath caught, a cold shiver climbing his spine, but he forced himself to stay still. Maxwell swallowed hard, his eyes distant, as if seeing a younger version of himself trembling in some forgotten corner of the world. "He saved me, and then disappeared, like he never existed." Eric felt his heart slam against his ribs, the past he had buried roaring back like a tidal wave, threatening to drown him right there inside the elevator. But before he could respond, the elevator dinged softly, signaling their arrival at the top floor, an immaculate world of glass walls and power, a world Eric never imagined he'd be dragged into again. The door slid open, and everything he thought he knew about his life, his past, his identity, and the secrets he had tried so hard to outrun was about to be torn open in a way he wasn't sure he would survive. Maxwell's private office felt less like a workspace and more like a throne room suspended above the city, a glass-walled fortress where every inch whispered power, success, and a life untouched by struggle, which made Eric's presence there feel even more surreal as he stepped inside, gripping his mop like an anchor while his heart raced with a dread he couldn't explain. And Maxwell, usually all sharp edges and ruthless confidence, seemed suddenly fragile, pacing behind his desk as though the ground beneath him was cracked. The silence stretched unbearably until Maxwell finally spoke, his voice low, trembling, stripped entirely of the authority that usually commanded rooms. And he said, "That tattoo, it belonged to a group, not a military unit, not anything official, something off the books, something most people never knew existed." And Eric felt the air thicken around him because he knew exactly what Maxwell was talking about but couldn't let that truth slip. Not yet, not when everything he had built for his son depended on staying invisible. But Maxwell kept going, unaware of the panic tightening Eric's chest, and he continued, "The man who wore that symbol, the first time I ever saw it, was named Eli Dawson," and the name hit Eric like a physical blow, knocking the breath out of him as memories he'd buried under years of janitorial shifts and single-parent responsibilities surged up. Memories of missions that never happened, names erased, lived in shadow, and the moment everything fell apart, forcing him to disappear into an existence small enough to keep his son safe. But Maxwell wasn't watching him. He was staring out the massive window, eyes distant with the weight of a memory that had clearly never faded. "I was 23, Maxwell said, voice hollow, reckless, naive. "I thought I was untouchable because of my last name. And then I got taken, kidnapped overseas by people who wanted to use me as leverage against my father. I thought I was going to die in that warehouse. I remember the smell of gasoline, the cold concrete, the sound of chains, and then suddenly the whole building shook like thunder. Someone stormed the place, but not a team in uniforms. Not soldiers, ghosts, people who didn't exist on any Eric's hands tightened around his knees as he forced himself to breathe evenly, but the pounding in his pulse grew louder with every word. "Eli Dawson," Maxwell whispered, finally turning to face Eric fully. "He was the one who got me out. He carried me even after he got shot. He refused to leave me behind. And when we finally reached safety, he disappeared, vanished, like he evaporated into thin air." Maxwell's throat worked as he swallowed. "My father spent years trying to find him, but there were no records, no files, no trace of him ever existing. It was like someone wiped him off the earth." Eric looked down, unable to meet Maxwell's eyes, because he remembered that day too, the chaos, the gunfire, the heat of his own blood, the sound of Maxwell's terrified breathing as he dragged him through the rubble, and then the command afterward, "Disappear. Forever. For your son, for your life." He had obeyed. He had run. He had become ordinary. He had sealed Eli Dawson in a grave made of silence and fear. But now, here he was forced back into that world by a simple accidental reveal. "Eric," Maxwell said, stepping closer, "that tattoo wasn't just a symbol, it was a signature. And the one who wore it changed my entire life." Eric forced himself to look up, but Maxwell's next words shattered the fragile calm he was clinging to. "Whole month ago," Maxwell said quietly, "I learned that my father didn't die of a heart attack." Eric's stomach dropped. "He was murdered." The word echoed in the room like a gunshot. "The people who did it," Maxwell continued, his voice cracking, "are the same people who kidnapped me all those years ago. People my father tried to expose, people who are resurfacing now, stronger than ever." He took a shaky breath, and for the first time in the entire building, Maxwell Hartley looked truly human, broken, grieving, terrified. "I need help, real help, and the only person who ever had a chance of stopping them was Eli Dawson." Eric's blood ran cold. His fingers trembled, because he knew what Maxwell didn't. Eli Dawson wasn't a ghost. He wasn't a memory. He wasn't a dead legend. He wasn't gone. He was sitting in this room, wearing a janitor's uniform, trying desperately not to destroy the quiet life he had built for his son. "You want to find him?" Eric said softly, his voice barely holding together. Maxwell nodded. "Not want to, need to." Eric closed his eyes for a moment, feeling a war inside him. Fear, grief, loyalty, love for his son, terror of being pulled back, and the crushing weight of a truth that would change everything. When he finally opened them, Maxwell was watching him, searching his face for something he couldn't name. Eric took a slow breath, steadying himself. "And if you find him," he asked quietly, "what then?" Maxwell didn't hesitate. "Then I'll beg him to save what's left of my family, and maybe, save me too." Eric felt the last piece of his carefully constructed life begin to crumble as the past he'd buried reached up with cold hands, dragging him back toward a destiny he thought he'd escaped forever. The weight of Maxwell's confession hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to break, and Eric felt the walls of the office closing in as memories he had spent over a decade burying clawed their way back to the surface, cold and uninvited, dragging with them the fear he had fought so hard to forget. He tried to steady his breath, to anchor himself in the present, the dull ache in his knees from long shifts, the faint citrus scent of the cleaning solution still clinging to his clothes. But the past was louder, sharper, filled with gunfire and shadows and whispered orders he could never unhear. Because once upon a time he wasn't Eric the janitor, the single father struggling to survive on minimum wage, but Eli Dawson, the man Maxwell was desperately searching for. And as Maxwell stood in front of him, raw and pleading in a way that defied his reputation, Eric's thoughts raced to Oliver, his son, the reason he abandoned that life, the reason he vanished, the reason he chose anonymity over heroism. He pictured Oliver's small hands reaching for him, the boy's sleepy smile, the quiet promise Eric made every single night. "You're safe, I'm here." But now Maxwell's words had cracked that safety wide open. Eric's voice wavered as he asked, "What exactly do they want? Why come after your family now?" And Maxwell, who usually spoke in clipped, commanding tones, ran a shaky hand through his hair before sinking into the leather chair across from him, looking less like a billionaire and more like a man trying to outrun a nightmare. My father," Maxwell said slowly, "was investigating them again right before he died. Not officially, quietly. He told me, just once, that he had found something he shouldn't have. Something big." Eric felt a chill slither up his spine. "What kind of something?" Maxwell exhaled, sounding defeated. "A name, a location, a financial trail. I don't know. He never got to show me." Eric leaned back, absorbing the implications. "And you believe they killed him to protect it?" Maxwell looked up sharply, pain flickering behind his eyes. "I don't believe it. I know it. Someone sabotaged his car." The coroner's report was altered. The security footage from the night before he died disappeared. All of it screams the same thing. Eric looked away, jaw tightening. He had seen this pattern before. Groups like the one he escaped didn't leave loose ends. They erased them, completely. Maxwell continued, "And now they're after me, quietly, strategically. They're not trying to kidnap me this time. They're trying to break me financially, destroy my credibility, isolate me. It's psychological warfare." Eric's pulse quickened. This was the same playbook, the same methods, the same ghosts resurfacing. Maxwell leaned forward, desperation tightening his voice. "Eric, Ely, whoever you really are, I need you to understand something clearly. I don't want revenge. I want survival." The name Ely landed like a stone in Eric's chest. It was the first time he had heard anyone say it aloud in years, and his entire body stiffened, instinctively slipping into the old awareness, the old calculations, the old readiness he spent so long suppressing. His eyes flicked toward the office door, scanning exits, security camera placements, the blind spot near the bookshelf, all without conscious effort. Because Eli Dawson, the ghost the world believed dead, never truly stopped existing. He had just learned to sleep inside Eric. Maxwell seemed to notice the shift in his posture, the subtle alertness humming back to life, and his breath hitched as though he had just witnessed confirmation of a theory he hadn't dared voice. "You know something," Maxwell whispered. "You're not normal. No ordinary man hides a tattoo like that." Eric closed his eyes briefly, the truth pressing against his ribs like a caged animal. "A normal?" he murmured bitterly. "A normal is exactly what I've been trying to be." Maxwell stood abruptly, pacing again, but this time with a new energy, a mix of hope and fear. "If you are him, if you're Eli Dawson, I swear I won't expose you. I won't tell any. His voice cracked as he turned, eyes glistening with the weight of unspoken grief. "I just need help before I lose everything my father died trying to protect." Eric swallowed hard, feeling a painful tug in his chest. Loyalty was a dangerous thing, especially when tied to a life he'd buried. But kindness, real kindness, left scars that never faded, and he remembered something suddenly, something from that mission years ago, Maxwell, terrified and trembling, asking him, "Why are you helping me?" And Ely, the man he once was, had answered, "Because someone needs to be kind even in hell." Eric felt the memory settle heavily in his bones. He had tried to leave that man behind. But what if the world still needed him? What if kindness now required courage he thought he no longer had? Before he could say a word, the office door burst open without warning. Both men jerked toward the sound as the head of security stepped inside, pale, breathless, eyes wide with alarm. Sir, you need to see this." Maxwell stiffened. "What happened?" The guard swallowed. "There's been a breach. And it's your son. He's missing." Eric's blood turned to ice. Maxwell's face collapsed in horror, and the past Eric fought so hard to escape snapped violently back into place. Because this wasn't just a threat anymore. It was war. And they had dragged another innocent child into the crossfire. Maxwell's face drained of all color so quickly, it was as though his soul had been ripped from his body. And before Eric could even process the words "your son is missing," Maxwell was already shoving past the head of security, sprinting down the hallway with a terror that cracked through every layer of his polished billionaire exterior, leaving behind only a father, a desperate, shaking father, while Eric followed close behind, his heart slamming against his ribs with a panic he hadn't felt since the night Oliver was born. That primal, all-consuming fear of losing the only thing in the world that mattered. The elevator ride down felt like torture, every second stretching into an eternity as Maxwell paced in front of the doors, running trembling hands through his hair, muttering fragmented sentences. "I was at school. I got a text. He should have been safe." And Eric could barely hear him over the roaring in his own ears. Because this wasn't supposed to happen. Not again, not to another child, not to someone he had sworn to protect once, and definitely not to the son of the man whose life he had once saved with blood-soaked hands, and a vow he thought ended the day he disappeared. As soon as the elevator doors opened, chaos swallowed them. Security guards running in every direction, radios crackling, employees whispering in fear. They hacked the cameras, the school called twice, someone posing as a driver, and Eric felt his vision narrow, sharpening in a way he hadn't allowed in years as instinct overtook hesitation, focusing him with laser precision on the details no one else saw. The timing too precise, the breach too clean, the method too familiar. This wasn't random. This wasn't opportunistic. This was deliberate, calculated. A message, a trap. And they had chosen Maxwell's son for a reason. Oliver flashed in Eric's mind. His wide, curious eyes, his small hands clutching his father's shirt, the way he would look up and say, "We're safe, right, Dad?" And guilt slammed into him because he knew exactly the kind of people Maxwell was dealing with. The kind who didn't care about innocence. The kind who saw children as leverage. The kind Eric had spent 12 years hiding from to ensure his son would never be used against him. Now they had taken someone else's child instead, and the realization struck him with devastating clarity. They knew Eli Dawson was still alive. Maxwell stumbled to the center of the lobby, panting, gripping his phone with shaking hands as he replayed the message he had received minutes earlier. A blurry photo of his son inside a dark van, strapped to a seatbelt, eyes wide with fear, tears in the corners. His small hands pressed against the window, and below it a single sentence: "We're not finished." Eric felt the sharp sting of bile rising in his throat as his old training screamed inside him. This was coordinated, professional, ruthless, and if they were sending photos already, they weren't planning to keep the boy long. Maxwell's breath hitched, cracking open a kind of agony Eric had only ever seen in war zones. Parents screaming for children already gone, and for the first time since they met, Eric placed a hand on Maxwell's shoulder, firm, steady, grounding the man who was falling apart. Maxwell turned toward him, eyes wild, cheeks streaked with panic. "They have my son," he choked. "They have my boy. How can I?" Because," Eric cut in gently but firmly, "he needs you steady right now. He needs us both steady." The word "us" seemed to anchor Maxwell for a moment, and Eric felt the shift, the unspoken realization that this man, the janitor he had insulted hours earlier, was now the only person keeping him from collapsing entirely. The head of security rushed over with tablets showing hacked feeds and maps, breathless updates spilling out. The breach happened at 2:17 p.m. The school's cameras were looped for exactly 90 seconds. A van with stolen plates was seen turning onto the expressway before disappearing completely. Maxwell clenched his fists until his knuckles whitened. They planned this, he whispered. They planned this right after your tattoo showed. They did this because of you. Eric flinched internally, because the truth was brutal and undeniable. His past had finally caught up, and a child, an innocent child, was paying the price. But instead of collapsing under the guilt, something in him hardened, igniting like a fire that had never fully gone out. Then I'm going to fix it," Eric said quietly, a promise etched with steel. Maxwell stared at him, eyes wide, searching his face for the truth, for proof that this wasn't false hope, and Eric didn't blink. Not once. Tell me what to do," Maxwell whispered. Eric inhaled slowly, letting the last remnants of the gentle, untrained facade slip away as the instincts he had buried deep rose from the ashes. First," he said, "we need to assume they're watching you. Everything. Your phones, your emails, your home devices, even your own staff. You cannot make any moves that look panicked or aggressive." Maxwell nodded shakily. "What about the police?" No police," Eric said sharply. Not yet. They'll kill the boy if they sense a swarm." Maxwell's breath trembled. "Then what do we do?" Eric opened his eyes fully, the last flicker of Eli Dawson settling into place like a final puzzle piece. "We hunt them," he said. But we do it my way." Maxwell blinked, startled by the quiet authority in his tone. Eric lifted his sleeve slowly, revealing the tattoo deliberately this time, letting it catch the light as the symbol glowed faintly beneath years of faded ink. "You wanted Eli Dawson," he said. "Now you have him." And before Maxwell could utter a single word, Eric added in a low, steady voice, "And I'm going to bring your son home, alive." The sound that filled Maxwell Hartley's penthouse wasn't the polished hum of wealth or the quiet static of city lights humming beyond the glass. It was the deep, uneven breaths of three people standing in the ruins of years of guilt, sacrifice, a silence so heavy it felt almost living, as if the apartment itself were holding its breath to see what would happen next. Because everything, every lie, every buried memory had climbed to the surface and now stood trembling in the open. And Eric, who had always moved like a man carrying invisible weight, finally let his shoulders drop as he looked at Maxwell and said with a raw honesty that cracked at the edges, "I never asked for anything. Not your company, not your money, not recognition. I only wanted Oliver to grow up safe." And Maxwell, the billionaire titan known for his ruthlessness, shook his head slowly as the truth he carried pressed hard against his chest before he stepped closer and spoke with a voice stripped of ego. "You saved my life, Eric. And I repaid you by building an empire on comfort while you were out there working janitorial shifts just to keep your son alive. I can't live with that, not anymore." And before Eric could respond, Oliver, still processing that the tattoo he had grown up seeing on his father wasn't just ink but a symbol of a brotherhood forged in danger, took a step forward and said with trembling conviction, "Dad doesn't need anything from you, but I think you need something from him." And Maxwell blinked rapidly, struck by the boy's perceptiveness, his throat tightening as he finally allowed himself to ask the question that had been burning through his thoughts since the moment he recognized the tattoo. "Eric, can you forgive?" But forgiveness was never simple, not when lives had been reshaped by choices made in shadows, and Eric's eyes glistened with unshed memories as he answered, "I never blamed you, Max. I blamed the world we were in back then. We were soldiers, ghosts, men paid to disappear. I chose a different one, and I'm glad, because someone had to make it out with something better." Yet even as he spoke those generous words, Maxwell shook his head and whispered, "No, you protected me, and I vanished into a safer future while you survived alone." And then, in a gesture that stunned even himself, the billionaire CEO bent down, not in humiliation but in reverence, and placed a hand gently over the faded symbol on Eric's wrist, the same tattoo that had once meant brotherhood, loyalty, and a promise sealed under fire, saying softly, "I can't erase the past, but I can change your future. If you let me." Who had spent so many years rejecting help out of fear of strings attached, felt something fragile and unfamiliar swell in his chest. The possibility that accepting kindness did not mean debt, did not mean danger returning, did not mean losing his independence, but perhaps gaining something he had never truly known, support without expectation. And as the room warmed with this new understanding, Maxwell straightened and turned toward Oliver with a gentleness rare for a man whose presence usually filled boardrooms with tension, saying, "Your father carried me when I was too broken to stand. The least I can do is make sure you never carry burdens he shouldn't have had to." And before Oliver could ask what he meant, Maxwell continued, "We're schooling, your future. Consider it taken care of, no debts, no conditions, just a promise I am finally able to keep." Because he remembered a night in the rubble of a collapsed compound when Eric, bloodied but unshaken, had whispered over him, "If I don't make it, you live enough for both of us." And Maxwell knew he had failed that promise for too long. So this, helping Oliver, was his chance to honor it. But Eric lifted a hand cautiously and said, "We don't need luxury, Max. Just dignity," and Maxwell smiled, a tired, grateful smile, replying, "Then dignity is exactly what I'll give." Before he offered Eric something no one expected. Not a charity position, not a symbolic thank you title, but a leadership role in the company's veteran outreach division, one with real authority, built around the compassion, resilience, and insight that Eric carried more genuinely than any executive in the building. And the proposal washed over Eric with such emotional force, that for the first time since his military days he felt seen. Not as a survivor, not as a janitor trying to stay unnoticed, but as a man whose integrity had value. And Oliver, standing at his father's side, saw the transformation bloom across Eric's face, replacing years of quiet endurance with something brighter, something he had almost forgotten existed. Hope, raw and luminous. And as Eric finally nodded, shakily, but firmly, the heaviness in the room broke into a warmth that felt like sunlight after a long winter. And Maxwell stepped forward, pulling Eric into an embrace that wasn't rehearsed or powerful or structured like a business gesture, but human, deeply human. Two men bound by a past scarred with loss and a future finally open to healing, and behind them Oliver whispered to himself as if afraid speaking too loudly might shatter the moment, "Oh, you deserve this," and Eric, hearing him, closed his eyes as tears slipped free, not tears of fear or grief or exhaustion, but tears of release, of a heart finally allowed to rest. And when the three of them stood there, connected not by power or status but by the simplest and rarest thing, kindness offered without condition, the city lights outside seemed to flicker in agreement, bathing the room in a gentle glow that felt like the world itself acknowledging the truth, that sometimes the most powerful identities aren't revealed by wealth or titles, but by the quiet marks we carry, the ones that remind us who we protected, who protected, and who we still have the chance to become.